Justin, welcome.
Hi,
So you were at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals yesterday in New Orleans
I was. Yeah.
around the oral argument around the Affordable Care Act, which famously, infamously, Ken Paxton has led the charge on for the country. Talk about what was discussed there in the court, and from a policy perspective, and in the mood in the room.
Well, first of all, I think you're right that Ken Paxton filed. He picked the judge, and remember, this originally was used as a distraction from his own indictment, where he's charged for securities fraud, and then other states have joined in, and now some states have opposed Texas. And what I would have done as Attorney General would have been to withdraw Texas from this lawsuit, because I think scholars from across the board, whatever your political stripes, conservative, liberal, moderate, independent, really think that on the merits, this lawsuit really doesn't have any legs.
Right.
Now, the mood in the room was different. There is a conservative panel. One judge was appointed by George W. Bush, the other by Donald Trump. And the third judge was appointed by President Carter.
Old school.
And that third judge, Judge King, didn't say anything. So the questioning was completely dominated, 100%, by the two judges, one appointed by George W. Bush, one appointed by Donald Trump. The questions were very skeptical towards the future of the Affordable Care Act. Now, this lawsuit, remember what happened. Let's just set the scene, which is that it's based upon the fact that the mandate penalty went to zero in 2017. Congress in 2017, you might recall the famous thumbs down by John McCain, who refused to overturn the other provisions of the Affordable Care Act. This lawsuit is seeking to change that thumbs down into a thumbs up and effectively overturn Congress's judgment that the remainder of the Affordable Care Act should stay in place, even as it took that mandate penalty down to zero, that tax down to zero. And the questions, and the reason for that was because John Roberts' opinion for the court was based upon the taxation power. So their argument is that, well, see, there's no more tax left, and so therefore the entire rationale for upholding the Affordable Care Act was this taxation rationale, and so therefore the entire Affordable Care Act falls apart. Even if the mandate goes away, that still really leaves unaddressed this issue, what's called severability. And in severability under the law, it's whether does the entire act fall if one part is unconstitutional. And here, we know the answer. In some cases, we have to guess, right? Because Congress doesn't know, doesn't anticipate whether it's going to be, one part is going to be unconstitutional or not. Here, in 2017, Congress specifically chose to keep the rest of the act, even as it took that mandate penalty down to zero. And that's why this lawsuit really is a gotcha lawsuit. The mood in the room, frankly, was, I don't know, it was a surprise, but it was one where it was clear from the questioning that at least two of the judges were quite skeptical towards the future of the Affordable Care Act, and that should concern everybody.
So, and if the court, well, let me just ask, so the next step, let's game out a little bit.
Yeah.
Where do we expect it to go next?
The next step is the Supreme Court, almost certainly. There was some hope before the argument that the Fifth Circuit would sustain the constitutionality of the act, and the Supreme Court just wouldn't have to touch it. I think that was a long shot anyway, that the Supreme Court would want to get involved. But now, I think clearly, if the Fifth Circuit is striking down as unconstitutional a piece of legislation that affects 20% of the economy, the Supreme Court's going to get involved. And so it's going to go to the Supreme Court next.
30,000-foot view in terms of the real-world impact of this whole thing, right? Let's talk about Texas and Texans, even though this applies to the whole country. But we particularly have a big problem with our healthcare system in this state. Highest uninsured in the nation.
Maternal mortality.
Poor health outcomes generally, given the amount of money we put into the system. If the ACA is found to be unconstitutional, is broken up, does go away, what kind of impact are we looking at?
Well, if the Affordable Care Act goes away, it's tremendously devastating for the state of Texas. And the first impact, obviously, is on the protections for pre-existing conditions. And this lawsuit seeks to get rid of those protections for pre-existing conditions. And it's not just cancer. It's if you're pregnant or if your baby gets sick or has a genetic defect that makes them more predisposed towards getting cancer later on in life. And these are what the entire American people have relied upon. All of us have relied upon now for almost a decade to protect us for pre-existing conditions. That all goes away. And what is so frustrating about this is that this is our taxpayer dollars who are paying for this lawsuit. And it is really just a shame. And so it's up to all of us really to just stand up and make sure that we are a real voice for protecting pre-existing conditions. As you know, in my campaign for Attorney General, I said one of the first things I would do is withdraw Texas from this lawsuit because I thought it was a really just bogus lawsuit. And that most importantly, we shouldn't be spending Texas taxpayer dollars to take away health care. People deserve access to quality health care, not taking it away, which is what this lawsuit seeks to do.
Well, and we wrote in our story yesterday that Ken Paxton had his day in court yesterday. He wasn't physically there, but it was basically his day in court.
Can I just say this?
Yeah.
He wasn't there. He wasn't at I was at both. I was at the district court hearing in Fort Worth. I was in New Orleans yesterday for the Fifth Circuit argument because this issue is important. This issue, it matters to millions of Texans, and he doesn't even have the guts to show up when he seeks to take away health care from millions of Texans, let alone Americans. It doesn't make any sense. He doesn't even have the guts to stand up and stand up for the consequences of what he's trying to do, and it's wrong. And by the way, it's not just Ken Paxton. It's Greg Abbott. It's a lot of the leadership of the Republican Party in this state and nationally who have said, go to do this lawsuit, and it's okay to take away pre-existing condition protections. I think there should be a bipartisan consensus to build around something that we can actually protect quality health care and protect pre-existing conditions and the rest of the Affordable Care Act. Even if you agree or disagree on whether the mandate is $0 or $400 or whatever else, can we not agree that everybody should have access to quality health care and have protections from discrimination against pre-existing conditions?
Healthcare, the ACA and healthcare generally is going to be an issue in 2020 elections at the presidential level on down, particularly here in Texas. It's already an issue in the Senate race here.
Yeah.
Among Democrats challenging John Cornyn. Looked like yesterday to me he got a little defensive after Democrats, whether it's the party, MJ Hager and others are really pummeling him, us too, by the way, are pummeling him about his healthcare record. He seemed offensive, at least to me, on Twitter, and had all this rant about what he's doing for healthcare. Do you see it being a seminal, pivotal issue next year in 2020, at least in Texas?
Texas and nationally. I think that it's likely, it's not a certainty, but it's likely, more likely than not, that this issue will go to the Supreme Court before the 2020 elections. And any chaos that happens, if protections for pre-existing conditions go away, the face of that is indicted Ken Paxton nationally and Donald Trump and the people who have voted. Remember, this whole argument that they're making is based upon a vote of John Cornyn and others to take the mandate down to $0. And so I think that we'll definitely have the argument that you suffer the consequences of votes and that there's accountability to the people. You saw it in my election. I finished only 3.5 points behind in the statewide race, the closest for a statewide office now, not including Senate, but the closest statewide office in a generation, really. And so you see this starting to change. And it's no longer acceptable to the people of Texas to cater to the extreme right wing or the extreme left wing, for that matter. What people want are people who are really going to try to work in the best interest of all Texans, regardless of party. And I think that's why John Cornyn became so defensive, because he realizes that his record on votes like this are going to come back and potentially be, quite devastating to him in a general election battle.
Really glad you were there yesterday. Thanks for talking to us on our story.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet.